For centuries, massive stone giants have stared silently across one of the most isolated islands on Earth. But what if their true age has been hidden, misunderstood, or quietly ignored? Buried statues, conflicting dates, missing records, disputed science. Some evidence fits, some doesn't, and some raises questions no one wants to answer. How old are the Moai really? Who built them first? And what happened before history began watching? The island enters the written record. Rapa Nui sits in the southeastern Pacific, far from any continental shore. It is often described as one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, a small volcanic triangle with 3 main cones and a narrow band of coastal plain. The best-known monuments are the Moai, carved figures that range from a few tons to many dozens of tons, with most produced from the volcanic tuff of Rano Raraku. Their presence is not in dispute. What changes from source to source is the timeline attached to them, and the reliability of the records used to build that timeline. The first European landing that entered common historical reference occurred on 5 April 1722, when the Dutch expedition led by Jacob Roggeveen reached the island and named it for the day of arrival. Written descriptions from that period focus on the coastline, the people encountered, and the visible statues and platforms. Those accounts were not archaeological documents. They were shipboard observations, made in a short window of time, translated and recopied through different hands, and framed by the priorities of an early modern voyage. Even so, they became a fixed point in later chronologies because they attach a firm date to the fact that the statues and their stone settings already existed in a recognizable form by the early 18th century. Other European visits followed in the later 18th century, each leaving a slightly different set of notes. James Cook reached the island during his second voyage in 1774, adding another layer of description of what was standing, what was damaged, and what could be seen from the shore and during short movements inland. In 1786, the French expedition under Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Pérouse, stopped at Rapa Nui on the 9th of April, again producing written observations tied to a precise date in a documented itinerary. None of these visits produced excavation, sampling, or stratigraphy. They produced descriptions that later researchers would use as reference points for what was present before major 19th century disruptions. A long interval followed in which outside documentation remained sporadic, while life on the island changed under new pressures. By the time systematic fieldwork began, many of the people who held older place knowledge were elderly, and the physical landscape had already been altered by introduced animals, shifting land use, and colonial controls. In that setting, early 20th century research became influential not because it solved chronology, but because it recorded monuments, names, and oral histories at a moment when they were still widely held and could be checked across many informants. The Manor expedition, led by Catherine Routledge and William Scoresby Routledge, ran from March 1913 to August 1915, with the team arriving at Hangaroa Bay on 29 March 1914 and working across the island over many months. Routledge's work emphasized mapping and documentation, including the locations of platforms and statues and the recording of local accounts connected to them. Her published narrative is not a modern site report, but it preserves details that later researchers would revisit with new methods and different questions. The practical result was a baseline, a clearer picture of what existed, where it was, and how it was described by residents in the early 1900s. Later projects shifted toward measurement, classification, and then dating. The Easter Island Statue Project, EISP, founded by Joanne van Tilburg in 1982 and continued with long-term collaboration on the island, represents one sustained effort to document statues in a standardized way, including quarry contexts and platform settings. Documentation matters here because the Moai are not a single construction event. They represent an extended sequence of quarrying, carving, transport, installation on Ahu platforms, and later modification or damage. A chronology is built by connecting multiple kinds of evidence to that sequence, and the connections are not always clean. In archaeological terms, the age of a statue is rarely obtained by dating the stone itself. Volcanic tuff and basalt do not usually provide simple, direct ages for carving events. Instead, researchers date materials associated with quarrying, transport roads, platform construction, and nearby habitation layers. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal, wood, or other organic remains can anchor activity in time if the sample is securely tied to a specific event and not redeposited. Bayesian modeling and careful stratigraphic control are used to reduce ambiguity where layers are complex. Work in the Rano-Raraku quarry region has employed stratigraphic excavation and radiocarbon-informed modeling to reconstruct sequences of landscape use around the primary statue source. This kind of work does not turn a statue into a timestamp. It builds a timed context for quarry activity and related land use. The broader settlement timeline of Rapa Nui also constrains what can be said about the statues. A widely cited study by Terry L. Hunt argued for a later colonization, around AD 1200, based on radiocarbon dates from stratified deposits at Anakena and a reassessment of earlier radiocarbon results. That argument, and the debate around it, illustrates how much depends on sample selection, context, and the treatment of older determinations that may be affected by inbuilt age in wood or by mixed deposits. When the start date of sustained settlement is under discussion, the earliest possible window for monument building shifts with it, even before any statue-specific evidence is considered. Separate from initial settlement are questions about how long construction continued and whether activity changed after major social or environmental stresses. A 2025 study reviewing radiocarbon and obsidian hydration evidence discusses continued debate over construction and modification events after roughly 1,500, 1,600 CE, with different interpretations of how much building continued into later periods. This matters for chronology because it affects how researchers read late-stage evidence at platforms and in quarry zones. A long building sequence produces overlapping traces, repairs, additions, reuse of stone, and disturbance from later episodes of damage or clearing. In such settings, a date can be secure for an event without being definitive for the first carving of a statue. Claims that the Moai are older than Easter Island are often rooted in a different kind of mismatch, a gap between what is visible and what can be dated with precision. Written records begin in 1722 for Europeans, while local history extends much further back, but was primarily transmitted orally and through place-based knowledge. Archaeological chronologies sit between those two, using material traces that can be sampled and tested. In that middle ground, uncertainties can be mistaken for empty space, and empty space can be treated as permission for much earlier ages than the evidence requires. The more careful literature treats the gap as a methodological problem rather than a license to extend dates indefinitely. A practical way to see the limits is to focus on what the evidence can actually anchor. European landings fix that statues and platforms existed by the early 18th century. Systematic surveys in the early 20th century fix the distribution and condition of monuments before many modern interventions, while also recording local accounts tied to specific places. Stratified excavations and radiocarbon programs fix windows of quarry and platform activity when samples are securely linked to construction layers. Each anchor is real, but none of them, on its own, converts a carved figure into a date etched in stone. The first step, before any larger argument about older than the island, is a plain inventory of how the island entered the historical record, how the main research traditions formed, and what kinds of dating are actually used in the field. The rest depends on how each line of evidence is weighted, and whether the chain from sample to event to monument can be shown without breaks. First dates in the sand at Anakena. Anakena Beach lies on the northern coast of Rapa Nui, forming a shallow bay bordered by low cliffs and dunes. It is one of the few places on the island where a canoe can be landed with relative ease under normal conditions. Long before archaeological work began, local tradition associated Anakena with early settlement and chiefly activity. When researchers began systematic excavation there in the mid-20th century, they did so partly because of these accounts, and partly because the beach deposits appeared deep, layered, and relatively undisturbed compared to many inland areas. Early excavations at Anakena were carried out in the 1950s by Thor Heyerdahl's Norwegian expedition, and later by Chilean and international teams. Heyerdahl's 1,955-1,956 work-documented stone platforms, house foundations, and cultural layers beneath the modern surface. His interpretations were shaped by his broader diffusionist views, but his team collected material that would later be reanalyzed with improved dating methods. Charcoal, shell, and bone samples from these early trenches were preserved in museum collections, where some were later subjected to radiocarbon testing. More controlled excavation began in the 1980s and 1990s under projects led by archaeologists including William Malloy, Sergio Rapu Hauer, and later Terry L. Hunt and Carl Lipo. These projects emphasized stratigraphic control, detailed recording of soil layers, and careful selection of samples. Trenches were placed behind and beneath the main platform, Ahu Now, and in nearby dune areas where habitation debris was visible in profile. In stratigraphic terms, Anakena presents a sequence of wind-blown sand layers interspersed with darker occupation horizons. The sand accumulates naturally through coastal processes, while the darker layers contain charcoal, stone flakes, shell fragments, and food remains. Each occupation horizon represents a period when people lived, cooked, and discarded material at that location. By documenting the order of these layers, archaeologists can reconstruct a relative sequence of events before assigning absolute dates. Radiocarbon dating was applied to charcoal recovered from sealed contexts within these layers. One widely cited series of dates comes from charcoal found beneath platform fill and within early habitation deposits. In a 2006 study, Terry Hunt reported radiocarbon determinations clustering around AD 1000, 200, 1000, 300 for the earliest well-supported occupation layers at Anakena. These samples came from short-lived plant material and were taken from stratigraphically secure contexts, reducing the likelihood that older wood had been reused. The emphasis on short-lived samples reflects a known problem in Pacific archaeology. Driftwood and long-lived trees can introduce inbuilt age, meaning the wood may be decades or centuries older than the event being dated. If such material is burned and deposited in a hearth, the radiocarbon date reflects the growth of the tree, not the human activity. To avoid this, later projects favored twigs, seeds, and small branches whenever possible. Hunt's results challenged earlier interpretations that placed initial settlement several centuries earlier, around AD 800-900. Those earlier dates often came from mixed deposits or from unidentified charcoal fragments. Reanalysis showed that some samples were affected by marine reservoir effects, redeposition, or poor stratigraphic association. As laboratory techniques improved and calibration curves were refined, many early determinations were reassessed and excluded from high-confidence chronologies. At Anakena, the dating program was tied directly to architectural features. Beneath Ahu Now, excavators identified buried occupation layers predating the main platform construction. Charcoal from these layers produced dates in the early 13th century. Above them, platform fill and paving stones were associated with later dates, indicating construction after sustained habitation had already begun. This sequence suggested that monument building followed settlement rather than preceding it. Additional samples from cooking pits and refuse layers showed continued use of the area through the 14th and 15th centuries. Obsidian flakes, fishbone, and shell remains were found in these contexts, indicating routine domestic activity. The pattern was consistent with Anakena functioning as a long-term residential and ceremonial zone rather than a short-lived landing site. Bayesian statistical modeling was later applied to the Anakena radiocarbon series. This method incorporates stratigraphic order and probability distributions to refine date ranges. When applied to the data, it narrowed the estimated start of sustained occupation to the early 1200s, with platform construction following within 1 to 2 centuries. The models did not produce single-year dates. They produced overlapping intervals that reflect both measurement error and contextual uncertainty. Other researchers revisited Anakena to test these conclusions. A 2013 study by Mulrooney and colleagues compared dates from Anakena with those from inland sites and quarry-adjacent settlements. Their results showed broad agreement with a post-1200 colonization model, though they noted regional variation in site development. Coastal zones appeared to be occupied earlier than upland areas, consistent with initial settlement patterns observed elsewhere in Polynesia. The Anakena sequence also illustrates how later disturbance complicates interpretation. Sand movement, livestock grazing in the 19th century, and limited construction during the Chilean administration altered surface layers. Some early trenches cut through mixed deposits without recognizing subtle boundaries. Modern projects therefore rely heavily on undisturbed profiles and microstratigraphic analysis to isolate reliable contexts. What emerges from Anacaena is not a single founding moment but a layered record of repeated activity. The earliest securely dated layers show people living, cooking, and modifying the landscape by the early 13th century. Monument construction appears later, integrated into an already established settlement system. No materials from sealed contexts beneath these layers have produced credible dates substantially earlier. These findings place practical limits on how early statue production can be argued on the basis of coastal settlement evidence. If sustained habitation begins around AD 1200 and platforms are built afterward, then the main phase of monument carving must fall within that broader sequence. This does not fix precise years for individual statues. It fixes the environmental and social setting in which large-scale construction became possible. Anacaena thus functions as a reference point rather than a final answer. Its carefully documented layers provide one of the clearest settlement sequences on the island. Other locations may show variations, earlier exploratory visits, or different patterns of use. Any broader chronology must account for both the strengths and the limits of this coastal record. Quarry layers at Rano Raraku. Rano Raraku is a volcanic crater located on the eastern side of Rapa Nui. Its inner and outer slopes contain the soft tuff from which most known moai were carved. The quarry is marked by partially carved figures still attached to bedrock, detached statues lying on slopes and buried forms exposed by erosion. Unlike coastal platforms, which are often cleared and rebuilt, the quarry preserves a long sequence of working surfaces and debris layers that accumulated during production. Early visitors noticed unfinished statues at Rano Raraku as early as the 18th century. Jacob Roggeveen's expedition recorded stone figures still in the mountain in 1722, and later travellers made similar observations. These accounts established that quarrying had ceased before sustained European contact. They did not explain when carving began or how long it continued. That task was left to archaeological investigation. Systematic study of Rano Raraku began in the mid-20th century. Thor Heyerdahl's expedition in 1955-1956 mapped carved figures and removed soil from selected areas to expose buried statues. His team documented dozens of partially submerged moai, some covered up to the neck by sediment. The work demonstrated that many statues had been gradually buried by natural erosion rather than intentionally abandoned in that state. However, excavation techniques at the time emphasized exposure rather than detailed stratigraphic recording. More controlled research developed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Projects led by Jo Ann van Tilburg and collaborators focused on recording quarry features, carving stages, and surrounding sediments. Detailed mapping, photogrammetry, and limited excavation were used to understand how working surfaces shifted over time. These methods treated the quarry as a layered industrial landscape rather than a collection of isolated sculptures. At Rano Raraku, production debris forms a major part of the stratigraphic record. Carving generates large quantities of tuff flakes and dust. These materials accumulate downslope from carving faces, forming thick talus deposits. Over time, soil develops on top of these deposits, vegetation takes root, and new carving surfaces are established above or beside earlier ones. The result is a sequence of overlapping activity zones separated by sediment layers. Excavations around buried statues have revealed alternating bands of carving debris and natural soil. A well-studied example is Moai, 146. Excavated between 2010 and 2012, sediment around the statue's torso and base showed multiple phases of accumulation. Lower layers consisted mainly of fresh carving waste, while upper layers contained wind-blown soil mixed with plant remains. Radiocarbon samples were taken from organic material embedded in these layers. Dating at Rano Raraku follows the same indirect approach used elsewhere on the island. Researchers do not date the statues. They date charcoal, roots, and plant fragments trapped within or between debris layers. These materials are interpreted as forming during periods of quarry use or temporary abandonment. The reliability of a date depends on whether the organic material entered the deposit at the time of accumulation or was introduced later. A 2019 study combining excavation and Bayesian modeling analysed multiple samples from quarry contexts. The results suggested sustained carving activity from approximately the 13th century through the 16th century, with possible continuation into the early 17th century. These ranges overlapped with dates from platform construction and settlement areas. They did not indicate an earlier phase of large-scale quarrying prior to known habitation layers. One complication at Rano Raraku is bioturbation. Plant roots, burrowing insects, and surface runoff can disturb sediments. Over centuries, these processes move organic material vertically through deposits. A charcoal fragment found at depth may not be as old as the surrounding debris. To address this, researchers analyze sediment structure, root channels, and particle orientation to assess disturbance before selecting samples. Another issue is slope movement. The quarry walls and surrounding hillsides are subject to erosion and minor landslides. Heavy rainfall can shift debris downslope, mixing materials from different periods. In some areas, thick talus fans show evidence of episodic movement rather than steady accumulation. These processes blur the boundaries between working phases and complicate chronological interpretation. Despite these limitations, certain patterns are consistent. Lower quarry slopes tend to contain older debris layers, while upper slopes reflect later activity. In some areas, early carving surfaces are completely buried and only visible where erosion has cut through deposits. In others, later workshops overlie earlier ones, indicating reuse of productive zones. The presence of unfinished statues at different depths also informs sequence reconstruction. Some buried figures are associated with early debris layers and were likely abandoned during initial production phases. Others are embedded in higher strata and represent later episodes. Their positions show that carving continued in multiple locations over long periods, rather than progressing in a simple linear fashion. Tools found in the quarry provide additional context. Basalt picks, used for carving, are scattered throughout debris layers. Wear patterns on these tools indicate repeated resharpening and reuse. In some excavated contexts, broken or heavily worn picks were discarded and buried by later debris. These deposits form part of the material record of quarry operations. Quarry roads radiating from Rano Raraku link production to transport. These stone-lined paths show wheelless traffic patterns consistent with sled or rope movement. Some roads cut through older debris layers, while others are overlain by sediment. This relationship allows relative dating between carving and transport infrastructure. Roads associated with lower debris levels are interpreted as earlier than those resting on higher deposits. Soil chemistry studies have also been applied at the quarry. Phosphate concentrations and organic content vary between working and non-working surfaces. Areas with prolonged human activity show elevated levels, reflecting food waste and plant growth around temporary shelters. These chemical signatures correlate with stratigraphic sequences and help distinguish occupational pauses from active carving phases. The quarry record does not support a single, short-lived production episode. Instead, it indicates repeated periods of activity, separated by intervals of reduced use. These pauses may reflect changes in population, resource availability, or social organization. Archaeology alone does not determine the causes. It documents the physical traces of shifting work patterns. Importantly, no securely dated quarry layer predates the earliest settlement horizons identified at coastal sites. Organic material embedded in the lowest debris levels consistently falls within the same broad time range as early habitation deposits. Claims of significantly earlier carving would require uncontaminated samples beneath these layers with clear association to production debris. Such evidence has not been documented in peer-reviewed excavation reports. Rano Raraku thus anchors statue production within a known archaeological timeframe. Its layered debris, buried figures, and tool assemblages provide a continuous record of work over several centuries. The record is incomplete and affected by natural processes, but its internal consistency limits how far dates can be extended. The quarry sequence does not reveal when the first statue was conceived or what cultural ideas motivated its creation. It shows when large-scale carving left measurable traces in the landscape. Those traces correspond closely with the period of established settlement and platform construction identified elsewhere on the island. Ahu platforms and construction sequences. Stone platforms known as Ahu form the architectural base for most erected Moai. They are distributed primarily along the coastline, facing inland in most cases, and vary in size, complexity, and construction method. Some consist of simple stone alignments, while others incorporate carefully fitted basalt facings, ramps, and paved forecourts. Because Ahu were built, modified, and repaired over long periods, they preserve layered records of activity that can be examined through excavation. Early European visitors noted these platforms without understanding their internal structure. James Cook described long platforms of stone in 1774 and observed statues lying nearby or standing on them. Later travellers made similar remarks, focusing on visible masonry rather than subsurface features. It was not until the mid-20th century that systematic excavation began to reveal how these monuments were assembled. William Moai was among the first archaeologists to document Ahu construction in detail. During restoration projects in the 1960s and 1970s, he supervised excavations at sites including Ahu Akivi, Ahu Vaiteka, and Ahu Nau Nau. His work involved dismantling collapsed sections, recording stone placement, and examining underlying deposits before rebuilding. Although restoration priorities shaped his methods, his field notes and publications provided foundational data on platform stratigraphy. An Ahu typically consists of several structural components. The core is often made of loosely stacked stones and soil, forming a mound. This core is faced with fitted slabs of basalt or scoria on the seaward side. A ramp or apron extends inland, sometimes paved with rounded stones. Beneath these visible elements lie earlier surfaces, buried occupation layers, and construction fills that can be dated if organic material is present. Excavation beneath platforms has shown that many Ahu were built in stages. At Ahu Nau Nau, for example, archaeologists identified at least 3 major construction phases. The earliest consisted of a low stone platform built directly over habitation deposits. Later phases expanded the structure, added facings, and raised the height. Each phase involved new fill material, which sealed earlier surfaces. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal and plant remains trapped within these fills, provides approximate ages for construction episodes. At several sites, samples from basal fills beneath primary facings have produced dates in the 13th and 14th centuries. Higher fills and repair layers tend to yield later dates, extending into the 15th and 16th centuries. These patterns are consistent with a gradual elaboration of ceremonial architecture. One difficulty is that platform fills often contain redeposited material. Stones and soil were collected from nearby areas, sometimes including older cultural debris. Charcoal in such contexts may predate the construction event. To address this, researchers prefer samples from intact surfaces buried by fill, such as hearths or occupation floors, rather than from within the fill itself. At Ahu Huri Urenga, excavations revealed a buried living surface beneath the platform, complete with cooking features and stone tools. Charcoal from this surface dated to the late 13th century. The platform above it was therefore constructed after that time. Similar relationships have been documented at other sites, reinforcing the pattern of monument building following initial settlement. Some platforms show evidence of reuse and rebuilding after periods of decline. Collapsed facings were sometimes cleared and rebuilt using the same stones. In other cases, new facings were added over older ones without removing earlier masonry. These practices create composite structures in which stones from different periods are interlocked. Stratigraphic excavation is necessary to separate these phases. Ahu also contain burial features. Human remains have been found within platform fills and beneath paved areas, often associated with secondary interments. These burials sometimes include grave goods such as shell ornaments or basalt tools. When datable material is present, burial contexts provide additional chronological markers tied to specific construction or renovation events. Coastal erosion affects many platforms. Wave action and rising sea levels have undercut foundations, causing collapse and loss of stratigraphic information. At sites such as Ahutapo and Ahuope, parts of the structure have been washed away, exposing internal layers. While this damage reduces contextual integrity, it also allows limited observation of construction sequences without excavation. Comparative studies across the island show regional variation in platform development. Western and northern coasts tend to have larger, more complex Ahu with extensive ramps and forecourts. Eastern sites, closer to Rano Raraku, often feature simpler structures. This pattern has been linked to differences in access to resources, population density, and transport distance from the quarry. Obsidian hydration dating has been applied to flakes found in platform contexts. Because obsidian absorbs water at a measurable rate, The thickness of the hydration layer can be used to estimate age under controlled conditions. When combined with radiocarbon data, hydration results help confirm relative sequences of platform use. At several Ahu, obsidian flakes embedded in early surfaces correspond to 14th century radiocarbon ranges. Soil micromorphology has also been used to study platform construction. Thin sections taken from buried surfaces and fills reveal compaction patterns, ash residues, and microdebris. These features distinguish living floors from construction layers and natural sediments. Microscopic analysis supports interpretations based on visible stratigraphy and helps identify disturbed zones. Restoration work conducted by Chilean authorities and international teams since the 1990s has expanded the dataset. Projects at Tongariki, Tahai, and Anakena involve partial dismantling of collapsed platforms, documentation of internal structure, and sampling for dating. Reports from these projects indicate consistent multi-phase construction histories rather than single-period builds. At Ahu Tongariki, the largest platform on the island, excavations revealed successive enlargement episodes. Early phases supported fewer statues and had narrower facings. Later phases extended the platform and added larger moai. Charcoal from buried surfaces suggests initial construction in the 14th century, with major expansion in the 15th century. Repairs after tsunami damage in the 1960s were carefully separated from ancient phases during restoration. Not all platforms were associated with standing statues. Some Ahu appear to have served primarily as burial monuments or ritual stages. These structures sometimes lack ramps or statue sockets. Their construction sequences still follow the general pattern of initial low platforms later expanded or modified, but their functions may have differed within local ceremonial systems. The relationship between platforms and surrounding settlements is evident in excavation data. Many Ahu are bordered by house foundations, gardens, and ovens. In some cases, domestic layers extend beneath platform edges, indicating that residential use preceded monument construction. In others, settlement debris accumulates against finished facings, showing continued occupation after building. Taken together, platform excavations establish a chronological framework independent of quarry evidence. They demonstrate that large ceremonial structures were built incrementally after sustained habitation began. Construction activity spans several centuries and involves repeated modification. No securely dated basal platform layers have produced ages that fall outside the general settlement and quarry time ranges. The platform record, therefore, constrains interpretations of statue age. Moai that stood on these structures must postdate the earliest construction phases and are often associated with later expansions. While individual statues cannot be assigned precise years, their installation is embedded within documented architectural sequences. Ahu platforms represent the visible interface between quarry production and community life. Their layered construction preserves evidence of labor organization, resource use, and long-term maintenance. These features provide a material timeline that complements settlement and quarry data without extending beyond them. Lines across the slopes and plains. Stone-lined paths extend outward from Rano Raraku toward many coastal settlements. These routes, often called roads or trackways, form a network connecting quarry zones with Ahu platforms and residential areas. They are visible today as shallow corridors bordered by low curbs of basalt and scoria, sometimes partly buried by soil and vegetation. Their presence indicates repeated movement of heavy objects and people across fixed routes over long periods. The first detailed descriptions of these roads appear in early 20th century surveys. Catherine Routledge recorded several major paths during the Manor expedition, noting their direction, width, and association with fallen statues. Later mapping projects expanded this work, using aerial photography and ground-based measurement to trace routes across the island. By the late 20th century, researchers had identified dozens of connected segments forming regional transport systems. Most roads radiate from Rano Raraku, following ridges, gentle slopes, and natural contours. They avoid steep inclines where possible and often curve gradually rather than running in straight lines. In many cases, they pass close to groups of standing or fallen moai, suggesting that statues were moved along these paths. Some roads terminate near major platforms, while others branch towards secondary sites. Construction of the roads varies. Some consist only of compacted soil worn smooth by repeated traffic. Others are bordered by carefully placed stones forming low retaining edges. In wetter areas, surfaces were reinforced with small cobbles. These differences reflect local conditions and maintenance practices rather than distinct building periods. Excavation of road surfaces has been limited, partly because of their length and exposure. Where small test trenches have been placed, they reveal layered surfaces. The lowest layers are often compacted volcanic soil mixed with fine tuff dust. Above them are lenses of gravel, ash and plant material, indicating episodes of use, abandonment and resurfacing. These layers form the basis for relative dating. Organic material suitable for radiocarbon dating is rare in road contexts. Most surfaces were kept clear, and any plant debris was quickly crushed or removed. However, in sheltered sections and low spots, charcoal and leaf fragments have been preserved beneath later layers. These samples provide approximate ages for periods of use when securely associated with surface deposits. A 2013 study by Lipo, Hunt and colleagues examined several road segments near Rano Raraku and along the north coast. Charcoal from buried surfaces produced dates between the 14th and 16th centuries. These results overlapped with quarry and platform chronologies, suggesting that major transport activity occurred during the same general period as large-scale carving and construction. Wear patterns on roadstones also provide information. In reinforced sections, the upper surfaces of border stones are often polished and rounded. Microscopic analysis shows abrasion consistent with repeated friction from ropes, wooden sleds, and possibly the bases of statues. These patterns differ from natural weathering, which produces more irregular pitting. Fallen moai found beside roads are sometimes used as indirect indicators of transport routes. Many lie parallel to nearby paths, with their heads oriented upslope and bases downslope. This positioning has been interpreted as consistent with movement from quarry to coast. While not all fallen statues are transport casualties, their distribution reinforces the association between roads and statue movement. Experimental archaeology has contributed to understanding road use. Since the 1990s, several teams have attempted to move replica statues using ropes, sleds, and rocking methods. These experiments have been conducted on reconstructed paths and natural slopes. Measurements of friction, rope wear, and ground disturbance have been compared with archaeological traces. The results show that repeated transport along fixed routes can produce surfaces similar to those observed on the island. Maintenance is another key feature of the road record. Some segments show evidence of repair, including added curbstones and resurfacing layers. These interventions imply organized labor and long-term planning. A road used only briefly would not require such attention. Regular upkeep suggests sustained transport activity over generations. In several locations, roads cross older cultural deposits. Excavations have shown that some paths were laid over earlier habitation layers, sealing them beneath compacted surfaces. Charcoal from these buried layers provides a terminus post quem, meaning the road must be younger than the dated material. At Anakena and near Hangaroa, such relationships place road construction after initial settlement. Conversely, some later deposits overlie abandoned roads. Windblown sand and garden soils cover sections that are no longer in use. In these areas, dates from overlying sediments indicate when maintenance ceased. These results vary regionally but often fall in the late 16th or early 17th century, consistent with evidence for reduced monument activity. Transport routes were not limited to statue movement. They also facilitated exchange of stone tools, food, and building materials. Basalt from inland sources appears in coastal contexts, and marine shell is found inland. Roads provided predictable corridors for these movements. Their chronology therefore reflects broader patterns of economic and social interaction. Spatial analysis shows that road density is highest near major ceremonial centres. Around Tongariki, Tahai and Anakena, multiple paths converge, forming hubs of movement. These areas also have large platforms and dense settlement remains. The correlation suggests coordinated planning rather than ad hoc trail formation. Not all roads are contemporary. Stratigraphic relationships and surface preservation indicate that some segments were abandoned while others remained in use. In certain valleys, older paths are partly buried and intersected by newer ones. This overlapping pattern implies adjustments to routes over time, possibly in response to erosion, changing settlement patterns, or shifts in quarrying focus. Remote sensing techniques have expanded knowledge of the road network. LiDAR surveys conducted in the 2010s revealed faint linear features beneath vegetation cover. Some of these align with known paths, while others represent previously undocumented segments. Follow-up ground verification confirmed that many are stone-bordered routes. Their integration into existing networks supports the interpretation of a planned transport system. Soil compaction studies add another layer of evidence. Measurements of bulk density along road corridors show significantly higher values than in adjacent areas. This compaction reflects repeated trampling and load-bearing activity. In some sections, compacted layers extend more than 30 centimeters below the surface, indicating long-term use. The chronological implications of the roads are indirect but consistent. They are built after settlement, maintained during the main phase of quarrying and platform construction, and gradually abandoned as monument production declined. No securely dated road segment has been shown to predate the earliest habitation layers identified at coastal sites. Claims that statues were moved along roads built in a much earlier period would require evidence of transport surfaces sealed beneath pre-settlement deposits. Such contexts have not been documented in controlled excavations. Instead, road stratigraphy consistently fits within the same general time frame as other monument-related activities. The transport network demonstrates how production, movement, and installation were integrated. Quarry debris, roads, and platforms form connected elements of a single system. Each has its own dating challenges, but their chronologies overlap closely. The roads, in particular, link inland and coastal evidence into a continuous material record. These pathways do not reveal motivations or symbolic meanings. They record repeated physical effort across familiar routes. Their worn surfaces, repairs, and eventual burial document changes in use without assigning causes. Within those limits, they provide another constraint on how early large-scale statue transport can reasonably be placed. The movement traces across slopes and plains therefore serve as temporal markers as well as spatial ones. They show when sustained heavy transport occurred and when it declined. In doing so, they reinforce chronologies derived from settlement layers, quarries, and platforms. Wood, rope, and environmental contexts. The island's vegetation history is preserved in sediments rather than in standing forests. Rapa Nui today has few trees taller than shrubs, but pollen records, charcoal layers, and plant remains indicate a different landscape in the past. Environmental studies do not date statues directly, yet they establish the material conditions under which quarrying, transport, and construction took place. Wood and fiber were necessary for tools, ropes, sleds, scaffolding, and daily life. Changes in plant availability, therefore, intersect with the chronology of monument activity. Lake and crater sediments provide the most continuous environmental records. Cores taken from Rano Kau, Rano Raraku, and Rano Aroi contain layered deposits of pollen, charcoal, and microscopic plant remains. These layers accumulate gradually, creating timelines that can be anchored with radiocarbon dating of organic material within the sediment. Because these basins are relatively stable, their records extend back thousands of years. Pollen analysis shows that before human settlement, the island supported a variety of trees, shrubs, and grasses. One prominent component was a now extinct palm species, often referred to as Pascalococos disperta. Its pollen appears consistently in deeper layers of crater sediments. Radiocarbon dates associated with these layers place intact palm forests on the island well before the first evidence of human occupation. In sediment cores, a marked decline in palm pollen coincides with the appearance of charcoal fragments. This transition is widely interpreted as reflecting human arrival and land clearing. At Rano Kau, this shift occurs around the 12th to early 13th century, aligning with archaeological settlement dates from coastal sites. The charcoal particles are small and frequent, consistent with repeated low-intensity burning rather than a single catastrophic event. Charcoal studies distinguish between natural fires and human-set fires by examining particle size and distribution. On Rapa Nui, charcoal peaks occur alongside increases in pollen from grasses and cultigens, such as sweet potato. This pattern indicates landscape modification for gardening and habitation. The timing places sustained human activity within the same window suggested by archaeological excavations. Wood was essential for monument-related tasks. Ethnographic analogy and experimental archaeology suggest that ropes made from bark or plant fibers were used to move statues, while wooden frames and levers aided in carving and erection. The presence or absence of suitable trees affects how such systems could operate. Environmental data therefore constrain how long large-scale construction could be supported without major changes in technique. Charcoal recovered from habitation sites and construction contexts has been identified to species level in some studies. These analyses show the use of palm wood, toromiro, and other native species in fires and possibly in tool manufacture. Over time, the diversity of charcoal taxa decreases, suggesting narrowing wood availability. This change appears gradual rather than abrupt. At Rano Raraku, soil layers associated with quarry activity contain charcoal fragments similar in composition to those from domestic contexts. This suggests that temporary shelters or work camps near the quarry relied on the same wood resources as villages. Radiocarbon dates from these fragments overlap with quarry debris layers, tying environmental use directly to production phases. Fiber plants also leave traces in the record, though they are less visible archaeologically. Phytolith analysis, which examines microscopic silica bodies produced by plants, has identified grasses and reeds that could have been used for rope and matting. These phytoliths appear in sediments dating to the main occupation period, supporting the idea that fiber resources were locally available during statue transport. As tree cover declined, erosion increased. Sediment cores show higher rates of soil deposition in crater basins during the later occupation period. Increased erosion would have affected quarry slopes, road surfaces, and agricultural areas. These environmental changes provide context for the accumulation of debris layers seen at Rano Raraku and the partial burial of statues. Some researchers have linked deforestation to the cessation of monument building. The environmental record, however, shows overlapping trends rather than a clear cutoff. Palm pollen declines steadily, while evidence for continued gardening and habitation persists into the post-contact period. Charcoal remains present in sediments well after major carving activity appears to have slowed. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from environmental cores must be interpreted cautiously. Charcoal fragments may be reworked or transported by water. To address this, studies compare multiple cores from different basins. When similar patterns appear across independent records, confidence increases that they reflect island-wide processes rather than local anomalies. The timing of environmental change does not precede settlement. No crater core has produced credible evidence of large-scale burning or forest clearance before the earliest archaeological layers. This limits arguments that monument construction occurred in a much earlier, undocumented occupation phase. The environmental signal of human presence aligns with archaeological dates rather than extending beyond them. Botanical remains from gardens provide additional chronological markers. Sweet potato pollen and starch grains appear in sediments and soils after initial settlement. Garden features dated through associated charcoal fall within the 13th to 17th centuries. These dates overlap with quarrying, transport, and platform construction, indicating that monument activity occurred alongside intensive food production. The availability of wood and fiber likely changed over time, requiring adaptation. Smaller trees, shrubs, and recycled materials may have replaced large trunks in later periods. Archaeological evidence of tool modification and repair supports this view. Basalt picks show extensive resharpening, and wooden elements, though rarely preserved, are inferred to have been reused. Environmental stress does not map neatly onto monument chronology. Quarrying and platform building continue through periods of declining tree pollen. This suggests that resource reduction did not immediately halt construction. Instead, production appears to have adjusted to changing conditions, at least for a time. Environmental data also record the impact of introduced species. After European contact, sheep grazing and new plants altered vegetation patterns further. These changes complicate the upper portions of sediment cores. Researchers separate pre-contact and post-contact layers through radiocarbon dating and historical correlation to avoid conflating different processes. When environmental records are placed alongside archaeological chronologies, they reinforce a consistent time frame. Forest decline begins after settlement, intensifies during the main occupation period, and continues as monument activity tapers. No independent environmental marker points to a phase of large-scale construction predating known habitation. The role of wood and fiber is therefore contextual rather than decisive. Environmental evidence shows that the materials required for monument work were present during the same centuries indicated by settlement, quarry, road, and platform data. It does not extend the timeline earlier, nor does it pinpoint exact years of activity. These records provide background conditions against which human actions occurred. they show changing landscapes rather than specific events. Within those limits, they offer another line of evidence constraining how and when monument construction could reasonably have taken place. Human remains and burial contexts. Human burials on Rapa Nui are closely integrated with architectural and residential spaces. Unlike cemeteries set apart from daily life, many interments occur within or beside ahu platforms, beneath paved areas, or near house foundations. These contexts allow archaeologists to link human remains to specific construction phases and occupation layers, providing additional chronological anchors when organic material can be securely dated. Early European observers noted bones exposed near platforms and described burials associated with stone structures. These accounts were brief and lacked detail, but they established that human remains were part of the monumental landscape. Later archaeological work confirmed this pattern, showing that platforms often served both ceremonial and mortuary functions over extended periods. Excavation of burials began in earnest during mid-20th century projects. William Molloy's work at sites such as Ahu Akivi and Ahuhuri Urenga revealed skeletal remains placed within platform fills and beneath pavements. These interments were typically secondary burials, meaning bones had been relocated after initial decomposition. The practice complicates dating, as bones may be moved long after death. Primary burials, where individuals were interred intact, are less common but have been documented in domestic contexts and near smaller platforms. When preserved, these burials provide clear associations between skeletal remains and surrounding deposits. Radiocarbon dating of bone collagen can be applied if preservation conditions allow and contamination is minimal. One well-studied area is the Tahai complex on the west coast. Excavations there uncovered multiple burial layers associated with successive platform modifications. Charcoal and shell from surrounding contexts dated these activities from the 14th through the 17th centuries. Skeletal remains within these layers are therefore understood to belong to individuals living during or shortly before those construction phases. Burials beneath ahu often show evidence of disturbance from later building episodes. Stones were added, surfaces were raised, and earlier interments were partially displaced. In some cases, bones were gathered and reburied within new fills. This reuse indicates continuity of place importance rather than abandonment. Chronologically, it means that the presence of bones does not necessarily mark the initial construction of a platform. Stable isotope analysis of skeletal remains has been used to study diet and mobility. Results show reliance on marine and terrestrial resources consistent with known subsistence patterns during the occupation period. Isotopic signatures do not suggest a population with a markedly different lifestyle predating established settlement phases. Instead, they align with archaeological evidence from habitation sites. Radiocarbon dating of human bone has produced results broadly consistent with other datasets. Where collagen preservation is good, dates cluster within the same range as settlement and monument activity. At Anakena, for example, dated burials fall after initial habitation layers, reinforcing the sequence in which people lived at the site before major platform construction. In some cases, human remains have been found within quarry-adjacent contexts. These are usually interpreted as burials of individuals associated with work areas rather than as markers of quarry initiation. Dates from such remains overlap with quarry debris layers, suggesting that burial and production occurred concurrently in certain zones. The spatial distribution of burials also informs chronology. Early occupation layers tend to contain fewer interments, while later phases show increased burial within monumental contexts. This pattern may reflect changing social practices, population growth, or shifts in ritual emphasis. Archaeology records the pattern without assigning cause. A challenge in using burials for dating is ethical and legal restriction. Modern regulations limit excavation and sampling of human remains. As a result, many earlier collections remain the primary source of data, and opportunities for new dating are limited. Researchers rely on detailed field notes and existing samples to refine chronologies. Reanalysis of older collections has improved chronological resolution. Advances in accelerator mass spectrometry allow smaller samples to be dated with greater precision. In several cases, bones previously considered undatable have yielded reliable results. These dates tend to confirm established timelines rather than extend them. Some burials include grave goods such as shell ornaments, obsidian flakes, or basalt tools. Typological comparison of these items with dated examples from habitation sites provides relative dating. When combined with radiocarbon results, they help place interments within broader cultural sequences. The relationship between burial placement and statue installation is particularly relevant. At some Ahu, burials lie beneath statue sockets, indicating interment before erection. At others, bones are found above pavement levels associated with standing statues, indicating burial after installation. These relationships demonstrate that platforms remained active ritual spaces long after statues were set in place. No securely dated human remains have been shown to predate the earliest settlement layers identified elsewhere on the island. Claims of much earlier occupation based on skeletal finds have not been supported by stratigraphic evidence or reproducible dates. Where anomalous dates have appeared, they are usually attributed to contamination or context mixing. Skeletal evidence also reflects health and labor patterns. Markers of muscle use, joint stress, and injury are consistent with a physically demanding lifestyle involving quarrying, transport, agriculture, and fishing. These indicators correspond to the same occupational phases identified through architecture and environmental data. Burial practices continued after European contact, but these later interments are distinguishable by historical association and material culture. Separation of pre-contact and post-contact remains is essential for chronological clarity. When this distinction is maintained, burial data aligns closely with other lines of evidence. Human remains therefore contribute indirectly to monument chronology. They do not date statues directly, but they mark periods of site use, modification, and ritual activity. Their distribution within architectural sequences helps establish the order of construction, use, and reuse of ceremonial spaces. As with other evidence, the burial record emphasizes continuity rather than abrupt change. People lived, worked, buried their dead, and modified their monuments over several centuries. The physical traces of these actions overlap, creating layered contexts that must be carefully untangled. Within those limits, skeletal data reinforces the broader archaeological picture. Settlement begins, monuments are built and modified, and burial practices evolve within a shared time frame. No independent burial evidence extends that sequence into a much earlier undocumented past. European contact and early descriptions. Written records concerning Rapa Nui begin with brief observations made by visiting ships in the early 18th century. These documents were not produced for archaeological purposes. They were logs, journals, and reports intended for navigation, administration, and personal record. Even so, they form the earliest fixed reference points for what was visible on the island at specific dates. On 5 April 1722, the Dutch expedition led by Jacob Roggeveen reached the island during a voyage across the Pacific. Officers and crew members recorded their arrival and described the coastline, the inhabitants, and large stone figures visible from the shore. Surviving accounts mention tall statues standing on platforms and others lying on the ground. The descriptions vary in detail and emphasis, but they consistently indicate that monumental structures already existed in substantial numbers. Roggeveen's journals were later translated and edited, introducing small inconsistencies. Some versions describe the statues as idols, others as figures, and measurements differ slightly between texts. These variations reflect both linguistic choices and the informal nature of observation. None of the writers conducted systematic surveys. Their attention was divided between diplomacy, provisioning, and navigation. The next major documented visit occurred in March 1774, when James Cook anchored near the island during his second voyage. Cook's journal and the reports of his officers provide a more extended description. They noted numerous platforms, some with standing statues and others with fallen ones. Cook remarked on apparent damage to monuments and on the scarcity of large trees, which he associated with difficulties in constructing boats. Cook's observations were shaped by his own interests and expectations. He compared Rapa Nui to other Pacific islands he had visited and focused on features relevant to navigation and trade. His descriptions of monuments were secondary to these concerns. Even so, they confirm that by the mid-18th century, the statues and platforms were already part of a long-established landscape. In April 1786, the French expedition under Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Pérouse, stopped at Rapa Nui. Officers recorded coastal views, interactions with residents, and the distribution of stone structures. Their maps and sketches include stylized representations of statues and platforms. These materials add visual information to written descriptions, though scale and perspective are often imprecise. La Pérouse's expedition also documented agricultural plots, stone enclosures, and house foundations near ceremonial sites. This association indicates that monument areas were embedded in inhabited zones rather than isolated precincts. The record again reflects conditions as they appeared in the late 18th century, without addressing their origins. During the early 19th century, visits became more frequent. Whaling ships, trading vessels, and naval expeditions stopped for water and supplies. Logs from British, American, and Russian ships mention statues and platforms in passing. Some note further deterioration, while others remark on continued local use of ceremonial spaces. A significant early 19th century account comes from Otto von Kotzebue's Russian expedition, which visited in 1816. Kotzebue's officers produced relatively detailed descriptions and drawings. They reported statues partly buried in soil and vegetation, suggesting long-term accumulation of sediment. These observations align with later archaeological findings of gradual burial rather than sudden collapse. By the 1820s and 1830s, missionaries and traders began to settle intermittently on the island. Their correspondence includes references to monuments, often framed in moral or religious terms. Some described statues as remnants of pagan practices, while others focused on their physical scale. These perspectives influenced later interpretations but did not add precise chronological data. Throughout these early accounts, several consistent features appear. Visitors repeatedly note large numbers of statues, widespread platform construction, and evidence of damage or collapse. None describe ongoing quarrying, transport, or erection of new monuments. This absence suggests that major construction had ceased before sustained European contact. It is important to note what these records do not contain. No visitor reports seeing statues in the process of being carved or moved. No journal mentions organized labor devoted to monument construction. The silence on these activities is significant, though it cannot establish exact end dates. It indicates only that large-scale production was not visible during brief visits. Descriptions of landscape conditions also provide indirect information. Many observers comment on limited tree cover and extensive stone features. These remarks correspond with environmental records showing reduced forest cover by the 18th century. They do not imply when deforestation occurred, but they confirm that it had already taken place. Mapping efforts from this period were rudimentary. Coastlines were sketched for navigational purposes, and interior features were rarely surveyed. As a result, early maps show only approximate positions of settlements and ceremonial sites. Later researchers have compared these maps with modern surveys to assess changes in monument distribution. The comparisons suggest relative stability in major site locations. Some accounts include measurements of statues and platforms. These figures vary widely, reflecting estimation rather than precise surveying. Heights are sometimes exaggerated, and distances are rounded. Nevertheless, they show that large moai comparable in size to those documented today were already present. Language barriers affected documentation. Communication between visitors and residents was limited, relying on gestures or rudimentary vocabularies. As a result, early writers recorded few local explanations of monument history. Where such explanations appear, they are brief and filtered through European interpretation. The most detailed early narrative of the island's monuments was produced by the French missionary Eugène Hérault in the 1860s. By this time, population decline and social disruption had altered many practices. Hérault described abandoned platforms and fallen statues, emphasizing decay. His writings reflect conditions after major demographic and political changes rather than earlier states. Photography began in the late 19th century, providing a new kind of record. Images taken by visitors such as William Thompson in 1886 show platforms and statues in various states of collapse. These photographs serve as benchmarks for later restoration work. They also confirm that no major construction occurred during the preceding decades. Taken together, early written and visual sources establish a minimum age for the monuments. They show that by 1722, and certainly by 1774, extensive statue and platform systems already existed. They also indicate that active construction was not observed during the contact period. These records do not specify when monument building began. They do not provide dates for quarrying, transport, or installation. They record only what was visible at the moment of observation. Their value lies in fixing endpoints rather than origins. Interpretation of these sources requires caution. Writers brought cultural assumptions and limited technical understanding. Some misidentified materials, misunderstood functions, or repeated hearsay. Later editors sometimes altered phrasing. Archaeologists therefore treat these documents as contextual evidence rather than definitive statements. Despite these limitations, early descriptions align closely with archaeological chronologies. The absence of observed construction fits with evidence that major production declined before the 18th century. The presence of extensive weathered monuments corresponds with multi-century building sequences inferred from excavations. No early account suggests a monument tradition extending far beyond the known settlement period. None mention structures that appear radically older than surrounding deposits. Instead, monuments are consistently presented as integrated with contemporary landscapes and communities. European contact records therefore serve as chronological anchors. They confirm that statues and platforms were established before sustained outside influence. They define a historical horizon against which archaeological and environmental data can be compared. Within this framework, written descriptions do not support claims of monument construction in a much earlier, undocumented era. They show continuity and antiquity within a recognizable human context. Their contribution is negative as well as positive. They rule out certain possibilities by their silence. The contact era record does not resolve debates about precise dates. It situates the visible remains within early modern history. It establishes that the monuments were not recent innovations in the 18th century. Beyond that, it leaves questions to be addressed through material evidence. Laboratory methods and chronological uncertainty. Chronologies for Rapa Nui are built from measurements made in laboratories far from the island. Charcoal fragments, bone samples, shells, and obsidian flakes are collected in the field, documented and transported to specialized facilities for analysis. The resulting numbers are then combined with archaeological context to produce timelines. Each step in this process introduces sources of uncertainty that must be evaluated before dates can be applied to monuments or settlement phases. Radiocarbon dating remains the primary method used for establishing absolute ages on the island. The technique measures the decay of carbon 14 inches organic material. Because carbon 1,4 decays at a known rate, the remaining concentration provides an estimate of when the organism stopped exchanging carbon with the atmosphere. For archaeological samples, this usually corresponds to the time of death of a plant or animal. Raw radiocarbon measurements are expressed in radiocarbon years before present, with present defined as 1,950. These values are not identical to calendar years. Atmospheric carbon 1,4 levels have varied over time due to solar activity, volcanic eruptions, and changes in Earth's magnetic field. To convert radiocarbon years into calendar dates, researchers use calibration curves based on tree rings, corals, and other independently dated records. For the southern hemisphere, where Rapa Nui is located, specialized calibration curves are required. The southern hemisphere atmosphere has slightly different carbon, 1,4 concentrations than the northern hemisphere. Using inappropriate curves can shift dates by several decades. Since the 1990s, laboratories have routinely applied region-specific calibration datasets to Pacific samples. Calibration does not produce a single date. It generates a probability distribution, often with multiple peaks. A sample might have a 68% probability of falling within one range and a 95% probability of falling within a broader range. Archaeologists must decide which interval is most meaningful for interpretation, usually in conjunction with stratigraphic information. Sample selection is critical. Short-lived materials such as seeds, leaves, and small twigs are preferred because they minimize inbuilt age. Large wood fragments may represent decades of growth before being burned. On Rapa Nui, where driftwood was sometimes used, this issue is especially important. Misidentified or mixed samples can distort chronological models. Contamination is another concern. Modern carbon introduced through handling, conservation treatments, or soil processes can alter measurements. Laboratories use chemical pre-treatment to remove contaminants, but these procedures are not always fully effective. Early radiocarbon dates from the 1960s and 1970s are sometimes excluded from modern analyses because pre-treatment standards were less rigorous. Marine samples introduce additional complexity. Shell and marine bone reflect carbon from seawater, which contains old, carbon depleted in carbon, 1,4. This marine reservoir effect can make samples appear older than they are. Correction factors must be applied based on regional oceanographic data. On Rapa Nui, variable upwelling conditions complicate these corrections. Obsidian hydration dating provides a complementary method. When obsidian is freshly fractured, it begins absorbing water from the environment. Over time, a hydration layer forms on the surface. Measuring its thickness can provide an estimate of age. The rate of hydration depends on temperature, humidity, and chemical composition, all of which vary across the island. To use obsidian hydration reliably, local calibration is required. Researchers must establish hydration rates using samples of known age. On Rapa Nui, this has been done by correlating hydration measurements with radiocarbon-dated contexts. Once calibrated, hydration data can help order surface collections and construction phases. However, hydration dating produces relative rather than absolute chronologies unless calibration is precise. Changes in microclimate over centuries can alter hydration rates. Buried flakes may hydrate differently from exposed ones. As a result, hydration results are usually interpreted in combination with other evidence. Bayesian statistical modeling has become increasingly important in synthesizing dates. This approach incorporates stratigraphic order, site formation processes, and prior assumptions into probability calculations. Instead of treating each date independently, Bayesian models evaluate how dates relate to one another within a defined framework. For example, if one layer lies beneath another, the model enforces that temporal relationship. Dates that conflict strongly with stratigraphy are downweighted or flagged as outliers. On Rapa Nui, Bayesian models have been applied to quarry sequences, settlement layers, and platform construction phases. These models can refine date ranges and reduce uncertainty. They can also create misleading precision if underlying assumptions are incorrect. A model is only as reliable as the stratigraphic data and prior constraints it incorporates. Poorly documented contexts can produce artificially narrow ranges. Interlaboratory variation is another factor. Different facilities use slightly different measurement techniques and calibration protocols. Results from separate labs may differ by several decades even for the same sample. Cross-checking through duplicate dating helps identify such discrepancies, but it is not always possible due to limited material. Reporting standards have improved over time. Modern publications usually include laboratory codes, pre-treatment methods, error margins, and calibration details. Older reports often lack this information, making it difficult to assess reliability. Redating of archive samples has therefore become an important part of recent research. Chronological uncertainty is cumulative. A single radiocarbon date may have a margin of error of plus or minus 30 years. After calibration, the calendar range may span 80 to 150 years. When combined with stratigraphic ambiguity, the effective uncertainty for an event such as platform construction can approach several centuries. Despite these limitations, independent methods on Rapa Nui converge on similar timeframes. Radiocarbon, obsidian hydration, environmental cause, and historical records overlap in placing major monument activity between roughly the 13th and 17th centuries. The convergence strengthens confidence even where individual dates are imprecise. Disputed early dates occasionally appear in the literature. These are usually isolated measurements from problematic contexts. When re-evaluated using modern standards, most are excluded or reassigned. Sustained early phases unsupported by multiple, well-contextualized dates have not been demonstrated. Laboratory methods also evolve. Improvements in accelerator mass spectrometry allow dating of smaller samples with higher precision. New calibration curves are released periodically, slightly adjusting older results. Chronologies must therefore be updated as technical standards change. For researchers, the task is not to eliminate uncertainty but to document it. Transparent reporting and cautious interpretation are essential. Dates are treated as ranges within probabilistic frameworks rather than fixed points. When claims are made that monuments predate known settlement phases by centuries or millennia, they must be evaluated against these methodological constraints. Such claims require multiple independent dates from secure contexts, consistent calibration, and reproducible results. Without these conditions, early ages remain unsupported. Laboratory science thus sets the boundaries within which historical interpretation operates. It does not deliver definitive answers. It defines what can be said with confidence and what remains unresolved. In the case of the Moai, laboratory methods consistently place associated activities within the broader occupation period. They do not provide evidence for construction in a much earlier, undocumented era. Their primary contribution is the careful measurement of uncertainty. Understanding these procedures is necessary before evaluating any proposed chronology. Without attention to calibration, contamination, and context, numerical dates can be misleading. With such attention, they form a coherent, if imperfect, temporal framework. Oral traditions and recorded genealogies. Before sustained European contact, historical knowledge on Rapa Nui was transmitted primarily through spoken narratives, ritual recitation, and genealogical memory. These forms of record did not function as chronological tables in the modern sense. They organized information around ancestry, land rights, ceremonial obligations, and social status. Even so, they preserve references to events, sequences, and relationships that can be compared with archaeological and documentary evidence. Early visitors noted the importance of oral transmission. Several 18th and early 19th century accounts mention formal recitations performed by specialists during gatherings. These recitations listed names of ancestors, chiefs, and founding figures. They were not fixed texts. Variations existed between families and regions, reflecting local affiliations and political relationships. Systematic recording of oral traditions began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Missionaries, administrators, and visiting scholars wrote down narratives and genealogies provided by elders. Among the most influential collectors was Catherine Routledge, who worked closely with Rapa Nui informants during the Mana expedition between 1914 and 1915. Her notebooks contain extensive genealogical lists and myth-historical accounts associated with major sites and lineages. Routledge emphasized the importance of consulting multiple informants. She compared versions of the same genealogy from different families and noted points of agreement and divergence. This method revealed patterns of convergence around major ancestral figures and settlement sequences, even when details differed. Later researchers continued this comparative approach. One recurring theme in recorded traditions is the arrival of founding ancestors led by figures such as Hotu Matua. These narratives describe migration, land division, and the establishment of social groups. While they are often treated as origin myths, they also encode information about relative sequence. Names appear in consistent order across different genealogies, suggesting a shared framework of descent. Genealogies collected in the early 20th century typically extend back 20 to 30 generations. Assuming an average generation length of 25 to 30 years, this corresponds roughly to 500 to 800 years of remembered ancestry. When calculated from the time of recording, these ranges align broadly with archaeological estimates for settlement beginning in the early 2nd millennium CE. Such calculations are approximate, generation length varies, and genealogies may omit or compress generations. Political considerations can also shape genealogical memory. Certain lines may be emphasized or minimized depending on status and land claims. As a result, genealogies are treated as relative rather than absolute chronological tools. Some traditions refer to periods of intensive construction and competition among clans. Accounts describe rival groups erecting statues and platforms to demonstrate prestige. These episodes are placed within genealogical frameworks, associated with specific chiefs or lineage heads. While not dated in years, they occur several generations after initial settlement in most recorded versions. Narratives also describe episodes of conflict, famine, and social reorganization. Terms such as Huri Moai, often translated as statue overthrowing, appear in later oral accounts. These refer to periods when monuments were damaged or toppled. The placement of these episodes in genealogies corresponds roughly to late pre-contact phases inferred from archaeological evidence. Early ethnographers, including Alfred Métraux in the 1930s, documented extensive oral histories and ritual chants. Métraux noted that while mythological elements were prominent, many narratives showed internal consistency when cross-checked. He distinguished between cosmogonic myths and historical traditions tied to specific places and families. Place names play an important role in these traditions. Many locations are associated with named ancestors, construction events, or disputes. When mapped, these associations often correspond to archaeological sites. Platforms, quarries, and habitation areas mentioned in oral accounts can frequently be identified in the physical landscape. Land tenure traditions also preserve temporal information. Boundaries between clan territories are explained through stories of allocation and inheritance. These narratives imply sequences of occupation and development. In several cases, archaeological surveys have confirmed that older habitation layers underlie later ceremonial structures in areas linked to early lineages. The transmission of oral history was disrupted in the 19th century by disease, population loss, and external control. The slave raids of the 1860s and subsequent epidemics reduced the population dramatically. Many elders who held specialized knowledge died without passing it on. As a result, recorded traditions represent a partial record rather than a complete one. Christianization also altered narrative practices. Missionaries discouraged certain forms of recitation and ritual storytelling. Some traditions were reinterpreted within Christian frameworks or abandoned. This process affected how history was remembered and presented to outsiders. Despite these disruptions, certain structural features remained stable across sources. Genealogical sequences recorded by Routledge, Metro, and later Rapa Nui scholars show similar ordering of major ancestral figures. Variations occur in minor branches, but core lineages are consistent. This stability suggests long-term continuity in social memory. Attempts have been made to correlate genealogical sequences with archaeological phases. For example, individuals associated in tradition with major building episodes are placed several generations after founding ancestors. When converted into approximate dates, these placements fall within the 14th to 16th centuries, overlapping with quarry and platform chronologies. Such correlations are suggestive rather than definitive. Oral traditions do not encode time in uniform units. They encode relationships, precedents, and legitimacy. Temporal interpretation depends on external assumptions about generation length and narrative stability. Some traditions describe the movement of statues using ropes and coordinated labor. These accounts correspond with archaeological evidence for road networks and transport infrastructure. The narratives do not specify when these practices began. They situate them within established social systems rather than at an initial founding stage. Accounts of quarry use also appear in recorded traditions. Certain lineages are associated with specific quarry zones or carving techniques. These associations imply long-term involvement with production areas rather than brief or episodic use. They fit with evidence for sustained quarrying over centuries. The absence of traditions describing monument building before settlement is notable. No recorded narrative places statue carving in a time preceding the arrival of founding ancestors. Instead, construction is consistently framed as an activity of established clans within the island's social order. Occasionally, traditions have been interpreted as evidence of much earlier occupation or external influence. Such interpretations usually rely on symbolic readings of mythological elements rather than on genealogical structure. When examined within their cultural context, these elements function as metaphor rather than as literal chronology. Modern Rapa Nui scholars have emphasized the importance of treating oral traditions as historical sources with their own logic. They argue against extracting isolated phrases or figures without considering narrative conventions. In this approach, traditions are read alongside archaeology and environmental data rather than against them. Recent collaborative projects have involved community members in interpreting historical narratives. These projects compare archival recordings with contemporary oral knowledge. While details differ, overall sequences remain similar. This continuity supports the view that core historical frameworks were established before major population decline. Oral histories also document post-contact changes, including the abandonment of certain ceremonial practices. These accounts correspond with historical records of missionary influence and colonial administration. Their integration into genealogical narratives demonstrates how new events were incorporated into existing frameworks. The chronological value of oral tradition lies in its relational structure. It orders events and people relative to one another. When multiple independent traditions converge on similar sequences, they provide a form of temporal consistency that can be tested against material evidence. In the case of the Moai, oral traditions place their creation and use within remembered ancestral sequences. These sequences correspond broadly to the occupation period established archaeologically. They do not extend monument building into an earlier, undocumented era. Like laboratory dates and stratigraphic layers, oral histories have limitations. They are subject to loss, reinterpretation, and political shaping. They cannot provide year-by-year timelines. They can, however, indicate whether major activities are remembered as recent, ancestral, or primordial. On Rapa Nui, monument construction is remembered as ancestral but not primordial. It belongs to the era of named ancestors, rather than to a time before human presence. This placement aligns with other lines of evidence. Oral traditions therefore function as contextual constraints. They do not determine absolute dates. They define the social time frame within which monument activity is understood by descendants. When combined with archaeology and historical records, they reinforce a consistent temporal framework. Claims of extreme antiquity and their sources, arguments that the Moai are far older than the commonly accepted settlement timeline, do not originate from a single discipline or period. They emerge intermittently from popular writing, selective readings of data, and reinterpretations of earlier research. To evaluate these claims, it is necessary to examine how they are constructed, what evidence they cite, and how that evidence relates to established methods of chronological control. One source of early antiquity claims is the reuse of outdated radiocarbon determinations. In the 1960s and 1970s, several dates were published from poorly documented contexts. Some were derived from unidentified charcoal fragments collected during early excavations. At the time, pre-treatment methods were less effective, and calibration curves were incomplete. These dates occasionally produced older ranges that, when cited without context, appear to suggest pre-1200 activity. Subsequent reassessment has shown that many of these samples were affected by inbuilt age, redeposition, or contamination. Another recurring argument centers on the appearance of buried statues at Rano Raraku. Photographs of Moai with only their heads visible above ground have been used to imply great antiquity, on the assumption that many meters of sediment require millennia to accumulate. Stratigraphic excavation has demonstrated that the burial of these statues is the result of gradual slope erosion, soil formation, and vegetation growth over centuries, not thousands of years. The sediment layers surrounding these figures contain materials dated to the same period as quarry debris elsewhere on the island. Claims based on soil depth often overlook local geomorphology. Rano Raraku's slopes are composed of friable volcanic tuff that erodes easily. Seasonal rainfall, combined with human activity and deforestation, accelerates sediment movement. Measurements of deposition rates in crater basins and on quarry slopes indicate that significant burial can occur within a few centuries under such conditions. Depth alone is not a reliable indicator of age without contextual dating. Astronomical interpretations also appear in arguments for extreme antiquity. Some writers have suggested that statue alignments encode star positions or solstice points from much earlier epochs. These proposals usually rely on selective orientation data and assume precise alignment intentions. Systematic surveys of statue orientation show considerable variation. While certain platforms align with solar events, the majority do not exhibit consistent astronomical patterning. Where alignments exist, they correspond to observable phenomena relevant within the known occupation period. Diffusionist narratives form another category. These propose that an advanced culture reached Rapa Nui long before Polynesian settlement, leaving the statues as evidence. Such claims often draw parallels between the Moai and stone monuments elsewhere in the world. Similarity in form or scale is presented as proof of shared origin. Archaeologically, these comparisons lack material linkage. No artifacts, genetic markers, or stratified deposits on Rapa Nui support occupation prior to the Polynesian sequence documented by settlement layers, environmental change, and oral tradition. Misinterpretation of oral histories also contributes to early dating claims. Mythological elements describing gods, giants, or primordial times are sometimes treated as literal historical accounts. In Rapa Nui tradition, as in many cultures, myth serves to explain origins and social order rather than to record chronological events. When genealogical structure is examined, monument building is consistently placed after the arrival of founding ancestors, not before them. Another source of confusion arises from the term ancient itself. In popular discourse, ancient is often equated with extreme age. In archaeological terms, a structure built 600 or 700 years ago can be ancient without predating settlement. Some claims conflate cultural antiquity with chronological depth, extending timelines beyond what evidence supports. Selective citation plays a significant role. Claims of extreme antiquity frequently reference peer-reviewed studies, but omit qualifying statements or methodological limitations. A single outlier date or speculative remark is elevated above a broader dataset. In academic practice, dates gain credibility through replication, stratigraphic consistency, and agreement across methods. Isolated results are treated cautiously until confirmed. Geochemical dating methods have occasionally been invoked to argue for greater age. Techniques such as potassium-argon dating are suitable for volcanic rock formation, not for carving events. The tuff used for Moai was formed geologically long before humans arrived. Dating the rock itself does not date the statue. This distinction is sometimes blurred in non-specialist writing. Claims based on erosion of statue surfaces also appear. Weathering rates are compared with those of monuments in other climates to infer age. These comparisons often ignore differences in rock type, microclimate, and exposure. Studies of tuff weathering on Rapa Nui show that visible erosion can develop relatively quickly under local conditions. Without controlled experimental baselines, surface appearance is an unreliable clock. In some cases, early antiquity arguments rest on the absence of evidence. Gaps in the archaeological record are treated as proof of lost phases. In reality, gaps often reflect sampling limitations, preservation bias, or areas not yet excavated. Absence of evidence is not evidence of presence, particularly when multiple independent datasets converge on a later timeline. Academic responses to these claims have focused on methodological transparency. When proposals for earlier dates are presented, researchers examine sample context, pre-treatment, calibration, and stratigraphic association. To date, no claim of monument construction substantially predating established settlement has met these criteria. It is also important to note how scholarly consensus forms. Consensus does not arise from agreement alone, but from repeated testing and revision. On Rapa Nui, chronologies have shifted as methods improved. Earlier settlement dates were proposed and later revised. The current framework reflects decades of adjustment rather than a fixed position resistant to change. Extreme antiquity claims often persist because they operate outside this process. They circulate in popular media, books, and online platforms where peer review is absent. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity can be mistaken for validation. Academic evaluation, by contrast, emphasizes reproducibility and contextual control. Some researchers have addressed these claims directly in publications, clarifying what evidence can and cannot show. Reviews emphasize that while uncertainties remain in precise dating, the broad timeframe is well supported. The difference between a construction starting in the 13th century versus the 11th century is meaningful archaeologically. The difference between the 13th century and several thousand years earlier is not supported by existing data. The appeal of extreme antiquity often lies in its implications rather than its evidence. Older dates suggest unknown civilizations, lost knowledge, or dramatic revisions of history. These narratives attract attention but require standards of proof that have not been met in the Rapa Nui case. This does not mean all questions are settled. The timing of initial settlement, the duration of construction phases, and the reasons for changes in monument activity remain subjects of research. These questions are addressed through incremental refinement rather than radical extension of timelines. When evaluated systematically, claims of extreme antiquity rely on misapplied methods, selective data use, or misunderstandings of archaeological practice. They do not arise from new, well-contextualized evidence. As such, they remain hypotheses without material support. The distinction between questioning a chronology and replacing it is critical. Archaeology allows for revision when evidence warrants it. To date, revisions on Rapa Nui have narrowed timelines rather than expanded them dramatically. Within the existing framework, the Moai are ancient in cultural terms and significant in scale and complexity. Their age places them firmly within the known history of human settlement on the island. Proposals that move them far outside that history lack corroboration. Evaluating these claims clarifies the standards by which chronological arguments are judged. It also underscores the importance of integrating multiple lines of evidence rather than relying on singular indicators. The examination of extreme antiquity claims therefore serves as a methodological exercise. It shows how archaeological knowledge is tested and why certain interpretations persist despite contradictory data. In doing so, it prepares the ground for assessing what remains uncertain without extending beyond what evidence can support. What the evidence can and cannot support. All available chronological frameworks for the Moai are constructed from indirect indicators. No method currently allows the stone figures themselves to be dated with precision. Instead, researchers rely on associated materials, stratigraphic relationships, and environmental records. These forms of evidence differ in resolution and reliability, and each imposes limits on interpretation. Settlement deposits provide the earliest secure anchors. Radiocarbon dates from coastal and inland habitation layers indicate sustained human presence beginning around the early 13th century. These layers contain domestic debris, garden soils, and structural remains that mark long-term occupation. No stratified deposits beneath these layers have produced reproducible dates, indicating an earlier permanent population. Quarry sequences at Rano Raraku show extended carving activity through overlapping debris layers. Radiocarbon dates from organic material embedded in these layers fall within the broader settlement period. Stratigraphic relationships demonstrate repeated use, abandonment, and reuse of working surfaces. The quarry record documents production intensity and duration but does not reveal the exact beginning of carving. Platform excavations reveal multi-phase construction histories. Basal layers often seal earlier living surfaces, showing that ceremonial architecture developed after settlement. Later expansions and repairs extend into subsequent centuries. These sequences establish relative order and approximate timing, but do not isolate individual statue installations. Transport routes preserve traces of sustained movement. Their construction over habitation deposits and burial beneath later sediments place them within the same general timeframe as quarrying and platform building. Wear patterns and maintenance episodes indicate long-term use rather than brief episodes. These features link inland and coastal evidence without extending chronology. Environmental records document forest decline, burning, and soil erosion beginning after settlement. Pollen and charcoal data align with archaeological timelines. They show that resources necessary for construction and transport were available during known occupation phases. They do not indicate earlier periods of intensive human modification. Human remains contribute contextual information. Burials integrated into platforms and domestic areas are consistently dated within the occupation sequence. Secondary burial practices complicate interpretation, but when contexts are secure, results align with settlement and construction phases. No skeletal evidence indicates an earlier population associated with monument building. Written accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries establish that extensive monuments existed before sustained European presence. They confirm that major construction had ended by that time. These records provide endpoints rather than origins. They do not describe earlier periods beyond what was visible. Oral traditions situate monument building within remembered genealogies. When translated into approximate generational time, these sequences correspond with archaeological estimates. Traditions do not place construction in a time before settlement. They frame it as part of ancestral history rather than primordial activity. Laboratory methods define the precision of these conclusions. Radiocarbon calibration, contamination control, and Bayesian modeling reduce uncertainty, but cannot eliminate it. Most dates carry ranges spanning decades or centuries. Overlapping intervals across independent datasets produce convergence without exactitude. Within these constraints, several points are well supported. Permanent settlement began in the early 2nd millennium CE. Monument production followed settlement rather than preceding it. Quarrying, transport, and platform construction occurred over several centuries. Major building activity declined before the 18th century. Other points remain less precise. The exact decade or generation in which the first statue was carved is not known. The rate at which production intensified or slowed cannot be resolved in detail. Regional variation in timing is only partially documented. Some areas may have adopted monumental practices earlier or later than others. The causes of changes in construction intensity are also uncertain. Environmental stress, social reorganization, demographic fluctuation, and external contact have all been proposed as contributing factors. Archaeological evidence records material change but does not isolate motivation. Multiple processes likely interacted in ways that cannot be reconstructed fully. Chronological gaps exist in the record. Some areas have not been excavated, and others are heavily disturbed. Preservation conditions vary. These factors create uneven coverage. Absence of evidence in a given location does not necessarily indicate absence of activity. Claims that monuments predate settlement by centuries or millennia are not supported by current data. Such claims would require multiple secure dates from contexts beneath known occupation layers, consistent across methods and locations. No such dataset has been produced. Existing evidence consistently places monument-related activity within the known habitation period. At the same time, caution is required when treating current chronologies as final. Radiocarbon calibration curves are periodically revised, new sites are excavated, archived samples are reanalyzed. Incremental changes are possible. Future work may shift date ranges modestly. What evidence cannot support is equally important. It cannot confirm precise years for carving or erection. It cannot identify individual sculptors or builders. It cannot reconstruct detailed sequences of political events. It cannot establish motivations with certainty. These limitations are inherent to the material record. Chronology on Rapa Nui is therefore probabilistic. It consists of overlapping ranges supported by multiple lines of evidence. Confidence arises from convergence rather than precision. Where convergence is strong, interpretations are robust. Where it is weak, conclusions remain tentative. The Moai exist within this framework. They are products of a complex society operating over several centuries. Their construction required coordination, resource management, and technical skill. These features are documented materially. Their deeper origins are bounded by settlement evidence and environmental change. No independent dataset currently places monument production outside the established occupation sequence. Settlement layers, quarry debris, platform fills, transport routes, burials, environmental records, oral histories, and historical accounts all converge within a shared time frame. Disagreement concerns internal structure rather than overall placement. Future research may refine this structure. High-resolution dating of short-lived materials, expanded Bayesian modeling, and new excavation in understudied regions may narrow ranges. Advances in geoarchaeology and microstratigraphy may clarify formation processes. These developments are likely to adjust details rather than overturn frameworks. Interpretation depends on maintaining methodological transparency. Claims must be grounded in documented contexts, reproducible measurements, and explicit uncertainty. Without these conditions, numerical ages lose interpretive value. The question of whether the Moai are older than Easter Island depends on how evidence is defined. If the island is understood as permanently settled by Polynesians in the early 2nd millennium, and monuments postdate that settlement, then current data does not support earlier construction. If island is treated abstractly as a geological entity, the stone itself is far older than carving. Archaeology addresses human activity rather than geological time. Within its proper scope, the evidence outlines a coherent narrative of settlement, development, and transformation. It does so without filling gaps with unsupported extensions. It establishes boundaries within which interpretation operates. Those boundaries are not expressions of certainty, they are expressions of disciplined inference. They mark where evidence is sufficient and where it is not. Respecting those limits is central to archaeological practice. The Moai remain objects of study precisely because of these limits. Their material record is rich but incomplete. Each generation of research clarifies some aspects and leaves others unresolved. This pattern reflects the nature of historical inquiry, rather than failure. What can be supported is a chronology rooted in settlement, extended production, and eventual decline. What cannot be supported is a narrative of monument building in a time before human presence. Between these positions lies a field of ongoing investigation defined by evidence rather than speculation. Thanks for watching. If this exploration made you think differently about the Moai and their hidden history, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. New videos are coming soon. See you in the next one.